there are just so many friends in the audience and people who mentored me, people who were colleagues going way back to residency, people that I had the pleasure to train and mentor, and I'm sure there are many new friends in the audience. And I have the disadvantage of, I know there was a lot of liquor flowing earlier in the evening, so, you know, how do we make this serious enough to give you good information, but also make it a little bit light? So I thought I would take you back to the 90s, okay? Because I was funded in 1990, so I want you to get into a 90 mindset. Anybody here was a Hood grantee in the 90s? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'm looking in this section. I moved from Tufts about a year ago, and it took me actually a year to go through 23 years worth of files and folders. And I'm a pack rat, in a good way though, because I like to keep documentation. And the interval of time between being officially named to be the NICHD director and actually moving, I had only about 2 months, and there was a lot to do during that time. So I just threw everything into a corner of a closet on the 9th floor of the Tupper building in Tufts. And the staff at Tufts were very kind to let me come back on the weekends and go through my files. So I did find my Hood Foundation folder from circa 1990. And I thought you'd be interested in seeing what the criteria were then for the Child Health Research Awards. And so this is the direct wording, so I didn't make anything up. The most important criterion was the likelihood of achieving foreseeable and practical results in medical efficacy. So actually, you did reference that tonight. There's also a preference for startup projects. The foundation at that time was specializing in providing seed money to get new projects underway, and we're looking for promising young projects that are not yet candidates for government support, and an emphasis on younger investigators. And at the time, I was a young investigator. The foundation was devoted to encouraging young people. And I thought this was interesting. They're looking for competence, creativity, with less of an emphasis on a track record or widespread recognition. Now, getting back to the 90s mindset, do you remember that advertisement, the Men's Hair Club? I'm not just the president, I'm also a client. It was from the 90s, so I thought I could use that here. I'm not just the director, I'm also a very proud and grateful recipient of Hood Foundation funding. And I found, I'm sorry I didn't really project well, but I found the actual award letter too in these files. And it was for 43,000 plus change. And at that time, it was only 1 year. You could not reapply. And I also found a letter from Ray asking a few years later for a progress report. And if I'd known you were going to be here, I would have put that on there too. And I just thought I would show you the 90s look. So my project involved the fluorescence activated cell sorter, which I'm standing in front of at Children's Hospital there. And you know, I'm sure those glasses are going to come back, so I probably should save them. But seriously, the award allowed me to hire my first technician. You know, in those days, we didn't get packages as instructors at Children's, and you know, we earned what we got, and the ability to hire a technician was really transformative. Being a young neonatologist, when you go into the NICU, it's all consuming. When you're on service, as many of you know, you don't have time for the lab. Maybe it's a little different now with computers and you can do things at night, but in those days you really couldn't do anything other than take care of the babies. So you basically dropped in and dropped out of your research. So to have a technician who could help you and who could keep the work going was so instrumental. And during that year, I had 3 peer-reviewed publications. I presented 4 abstracts at national meetings, and I already had the Physician Scientist Award, but this really allowed me to be super productive and really allowed me to get that next grant. So to get over what they now call the valley of death between being an early investigator and an established investigator. We'll talk about that later. So I titled my talk The Return on Investment because I knew there would be some business types here. And I also found this progress report, and I really honestly couldn't remember what did I do with the Hood Foundation funding. But we were working at the time on isolating intact fetal cells from the blood of pregnant women to use that as a non-invasive prenatal test for a variety of genetic abnormalities. And this is from one of the publications that emanated from the work in which we characterized fetal nucleated erythrocytes that were in the blood of pregnant women. Well, it was a little bit ahead of its time and needed DNA sequencing technology to become available. And we moved over the interval of time in the next few years from intact cells to analyzing cell-free DNA in the blood of pregnant women. And the reason why I mention this is I am just incredibly privileged to have started a project in medical school that really did translate to clinical care. And so this paper in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that you could take the blood of pregnant women and use the cell-free DNA circulating from the placenta to screen for a variety of fetal chromosome abnormalities. And that testing has translated to care. In fact, over 6 million pregnant women have had this test since it first became clinically available in 2011. And here you see so you look at the number of tests. The test first became clinically available in 2011, and over the next 3 years, you could just see that this incredible upturn in the number of tests, but it also transformed care, because the red line refers to invasive diagnostic tests. And some of the women in the audience, including myself, will have had an amniocentesis, for example. There are very few amniocenteses being performed anymore because this test, as a screening test, is so sensitive for the detection of chromosome problems that it really has completely, no, not completely, but nearly completely eliminated the need for these invasive tests. We haven't stopped there. I'm fortunate that I have a laboratory at NIH as well as being a director, so I get to leave the administrative world a few times a week and go up, and we are working there on the next phase, which is prenatal treatment to improve neurocognition in Down syndrome. So it's terrific to be able to do that and not have to write grants either. And so we talk about non-invasive prenatal testing and prenatal genomics as a success story of genomic medicine, because it's the part of genomics that has really matured and has been implemented most dramatically into clinical care, and it's leading to new observations. So our own work, we've shown that pregnant women, for example, can have cancer detected through these prenatal tests, because what happens is you get very, very unusual prenatal DNA results. And if you open up the results and look more closely, you realize that there's widespread genomic imbalance, and that's very characteristic of certain tumors that are shedding DNA into the blood of the pregnant women. So we found incidental findings that include cancer. We also have an appreciation of how mosaic you can be and still be normal. So as a pediatrician, I was always told that, well, there are no people surviving with trisomy 8 unless you have a particular malignancy, but we found that there are a significant number of apparently healthy women who have trisomy 8 at some level, and you find it with this prenatal testing. We also have a better appreciation of how you can have sex chromosome abnormalities. You can have Turner syndrome and be pregnant and not realize that you have Turner syndrome. So all of this has come as secondary results from this now routinely applied prenatal testing. So there clearly has been scientific return, and there's personal return too. So yet another picture with these horrible big glasses. But this is in all seriousness that the seed funding given to young investigators like I was, and I know we have a bunch of young investigators in the room, this is given to people at an incredibly vulnerable point in their careers, and it's truly transformative because it's a confidence builder. It allows you to get help. It puts something on your resume that then you leverage on to future grants. And this is a group of people that, we've invested so much in them in terms of their training. They've been exquisitely trained clinically. Many of them are doing subspecialty fellowships, and these are the future leaders, and yet they're constantly pulled between the clinical world where they can earn a lot more money and the research world where they would like to work, but there's so many pressures there. And these early stage investigator grants truly bring people into the field and keep them in the field. So my story is it's a big surprise to me too, that you could go from, I didn't show the pictures of what the rest of the lab looked like, because the lab was probably one of the worst labs in the Enders building. It was just incredibly full of rust and dirt. But I could go from that, literally like Cinderella, and then find myself at the NIH in 2017. And by the way, that was election day, so you can imagine how memorable a day that was. So in the rest of the time, and I promise I won't go over time, I'm going to talk about several things that I think are related to everyone's interests. And I think Francis Collins said at the ASHG recently, when he was talking with Bill Gates, he thinks, he has to herd a bunch of cats at the NIH or investigators extramurally, but he's got a big bag of cat food. And that's the way I feel. You have to listen to me, because I've got a big bag of cat food, and everybody wants to hear about money, right? So hopefully we'll keep you awake. But I'm going to talk a little bit about NICHD's efforts to encourage and support promising young investigators, the importance of data sharing, especially in the early stages of careers. And then I'm going to talk about NICHD's experience in a successful private-public partnership with a family foundation, and then just some parting thoughts. So many of you probably don't realize the broad mission of the NICHD. So we're named the Eunice Kennedy Shriver for Eunice Kennedy Shriver, President John F. Kennedy's sister, and I guess today's an important day in John F. Kennedy history because of the documents that are being released. But his sister, everybody says his sister would have been president, that she was really a go-getter, incredibly focused on her mission, and she was incredibly devoted to children with disabilities. And she started the Special Olympics. And I'm very lucky to work with her son, Tim Shriver, who has a lot of her passion, and he is the current director of the Special Olympics, and he serves on our advisory council. But what you probably don't realize is NICHD only funds 18% of pediatric research at NIH. So for those of you who are thinking about where you should apply for your next grant, I'm going to show you a slide that may give you some thoughts about other potential institutes. We fund everything related to pregnancy, but you probably don't know that 6.5% of our budget goes to people with physical disabilities. So that includes children and adults. So NICHD is actually funding research on people who've lost their limbs or people who are recovering from strokes. Here's a very important graph, because you can see that NICHD funds the majority of child health research, but the other institutes include the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and the National Institute of Mental Health. Those are the other big institutes. And the pay lines differ at the different institutes. And in fact, for example, a lot of pediatric pulmonary research, even in NICU graduates, is being funded by the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, not by Child Health. So I borrowed this from Bob because he had sent this in an email to me where he was also concerned about the fate of clinician scientists. And you can see that it looks like about 10% of MDs are, of the HODE awardees are MDs, which I have to assume means the 90% of them are PhDs. And on the other part of the slide, the MD PhDs are being compared to the MDs. But this type of trend is very similar to NIH. MD clinician scientists are having a really hard time getting funded. So what are we doing? Well, first of all, we are totally committed to keeping our training budget where it is. If we get a bigger budget, we can always expand it, but we have historically been at around 6% of our total extramural budget being committed to training and career development. And it's been stable over the past 30 years, and it's not going to change. What is different about NICHD, if you look at the arrow and the red part, we have a very large part of our budget devoted to institutional training grants as opposed to individual training grants. So in the institutional grant, an institution applies and they get slots, and then they decide who will fill those slots. So many of you were trained on K-12 awards. In the individual grants, you find a mentor and you write an application with your mentor, and that gets peer reviewed. So it's because so much of our budget has been devoted to the institutional awards, what has been sacrificed are the individual success rates. And so when I came in about a year ago, I said, well, what should we tell people? Is it better to be on an institutional award? Is it better to be on an individual award? So we did an analysis of a cohort of our trainees who had trained in 1999 to 2001 because we needed time to find out what had happened to these people. I was sort of looking at it, if I were going to give one of you a piece of advice, what should we do? Let's say Jonathan Davis is coming to my office and wants to know what type of award should he apply for if he wants to be successful long term. So we looked at people who only had MDs and people who had MDs plus PhDs on the right. We looked at application rates and successful funding. And it turns out if you have an MD and a PhD like Bob Segi, it doesn't matter because you will be successful no matter what you do. You can see all of those groups were fairly evenly successful. The group that's especially vulnerable are the people who have only MDs. If you have a PhD, you've spent time in a lab, you've done research, you've written papers, you know what it's all about. If you're an MD, you've spent your time doing clinical training. You don't necessarily know what it's all about. So what we found for the MD onlys is if they only trained on an institutional K grant, they applied less and they were not funded at the same rate as people who either had only an individual K or people who had a combination of both. At the end of the day, and I'm not going to show you the graph here, but the majority of K-12 graduates ended up in academic, clinical. This is just the 1999 to 2001 cohort, but the majority of those people ended up in clinical academic jobs, whereas the individual K cohort ended up in more research-oriented jobs. So there's a whole study on this that has been accepted for publication in JAMA Pediatrics, so you will see that soon. And because of those data, which are very compelling, that red percentage of our total grants is going to push back, and we will make more money available for individual Ks. We're not eliminating all the K-12s, but we are going to think very thoughtfully. And those of you who are pediatric chairs, we're going to have a discussion at the next AMSPDAC meeting about how to think creatively, how to use the money that we have to support young investigators, but kind of get the best out of the institutional K awards. The other thing NICHD is doing is taking a flexible pay line approach. So for those of you who are applying for NICHD funding, we are not using a strict pay line. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, your grants get a score, and if the score, let's say, was the 9th percentile, you had to do better than that to get funded. Now we're taking grants that get a score up to a certain range and then look at them more closely to decide which topics align much more closely with our priorities. About half the institutes at NIH are doing this. It's very important because otherwise you're relying on the study section, which may or may not have, I mean, we're looking at the ones that they favorably reviewed, but they may not agree with our priorities. So we're using our priorities to change the pay line. So what do these bar graphs show? They show 3 different years. The blue grants are the ones that were successfully funded, and they're all shifted to the left. What you will see over time now is you'll see more grants possibly going up into the higher percentiles, which means that they were more closely aligned with things that we're interested in. The example I always use when I served on the advisory council was I was asked to weigh in on a grant that was scored at the 1 percentile, the 1st percentile, so the highest possible score you can get, but it was on marital therapy, which it's an important topic to some people, but it's not a priority for the Child Health Institute. But it got a perfect score. So what do you do with that information? Well, we had to fund it because it was within the pay line, but it really isn't a priority. So that wouldn't happen nowadays. So how else can you help people get to be successful? Well, we are making a major commitment to data sharing. That is the mantra at NIH. But at NICHD, we have something called the Data and Specimen Hub, or DASH. We're also making a resource available called the Placental Atlas tool. And we're also inventorying all our biospecimens that were collected under other studies. We're looking to see, do we have appropriate consents? Is the biomaterial usable? And then they will be available through DASH. So the reason why I'm so excited about DASH is it is a great opportunity for young investigators to get started. These are basically, right now, we have 47 studies available, literally, once you register, at the click of a link, to get de-identified data sets from a variety of clinical studies. You can see the topics. There are a lot, for example, in pregnancy and neonatology. There are a lot of infectious diseases, but over time we will continue to upload studies, and there will be, by the end of this year, accompanying biospecimens for these studies. So I say to young investigators, you know, while you're taking that year to get your IRB protocol approved, start testing hypotheses with publicly available data. And then you don't have to worry about recruiting subjects or not getting enough specimens. You know, use things that are already available. And in fact, we have, did you want to get a slide of the DASH? So just, if you Google NICHD DASH, but the website is up there. We already have publications that are coming out from young investigators who have been using the DASH. And it's not ready yet, but we're also, you know, you may know that we've spent somewhere between $40 and $50 million on the Human Placenta Project. The placenta is the one organ that the NICHD pretty much owns. You know, there are other institutes that have kidneys or the heart. We have the placenta. But the placenta deserves respect because it was your heart, it was your lungs, it was your endocrine system, it was your GI system, etc. So we will be having this kind of one-stop shopping for the Placental Atlas tool, and it's going to allow anybody who's interested in the placenta to search and curate articles, to integrate data, to analyze data, visualize data from a gross view of the placenta down into the microscopic level and beyond, and then links to external resources. Now, most of you know, if you've been following what's going on at NIH, we've had a tumultuous year in terms of all kinds of proposals to make more money available for young investigators. I know David Williams came down to NIH to talk passionately about not capping grants and looking at other opportunities. So eventually, Dr. Collins came up with, and his team came up with two definitions: the early stage investigators, who are investigators within 10 years of completing their clinical training or their postgraduate, postdoctoral type of training, and the early established investigator. And the good news is each institute is being given guidelines for funding. So they identify who are the early stage investigators, so we get a list, and we are giving them preferential consideration. So this is in addition to the flexible pay line. Those of you who are ESIs or EEIs, we have certain targets that the NIH wants to make. And I have to say that NICHD is doing much better than most of the other institutes in terms of funding EEIs and ESIs. And in fact, I have a director's fund, and I used virtually all of it this year to fund early stage investigators because I feel so strongly about that. So just moving on, public-private partnerships, which really is, we're here celebrating the Hood Foundation. And we do have, this was news to me, I didn't realize that NIH worked with private organizations, but we do. They're science-driven. Obviously, they adhere to all the principles of NIH. And they involve both industry and foundations, as well as, obviously, academic institutions. And there's a lot of discussion up front first before the MOUs are signed. And they're all different. But I thought I would talk a little bit about the one. NICHD only has one, and that's with another family foundation, which is the Mars Foundation. So Mars as in candy. But we do not, we thought it would be a little bit hypocritical for a child health organization to do research on candy. So, but fortunately, Mars has, and this, I didn't know this, but they have a huge portfolio on pet nutrition. They virtually, make all of the pet food that your cats and dogs eat. And they also own a lot of the veterinary hospitals. So I don't even remember the names because I don't have a cat or a dog, but everybody knows the names of these veterinary hospitals. So we partner with the Mars Foundation. They were very interested in funding scientific research, but they didn't have the bandwidth to do the peer review. So we talked with them, not we, it was before my time, but my colleagues talked with them and established the fact that because of the pet food part of their business, they were very interested in doing research on human-animal interactions. So we basically fund a fairly significant portfolio. Now, it's something that we never did before because it really wasn't a priority, but the interest was to see how having a pet impacts on child health and child behavior. And I could give you a whole long list of publications. It's been a very successful partnership, but I thought I would cite two different studies. So in one study, that's a Siamese fighting fish, if you didn't know what that is on the right. But caring for this type of fish helped self-monitoring and blood glucose levels in teens with type 1 diabetes. So somehow caring for the fish improved their own monitoring and their own regulation of what they were doing during the day. And then, not surprisingly, because I'm in my work as a geneticist with children with intellectual disabilities, there's a lot of interest in hippotherapy, for example, horseback riding, and the effect of animals on children with intellectual disabilities. But guinea pigs, which, by the way, here's a tidbit, after dinner tidbit. Guinea pigs have the most similar placenta to humans. So who would ever think that? But anyway, so the kids with autism who had guinea pigs did a lot better, and it reduced their anxiety. They did much better in school. They were more socially engaged. So over the 10 years, we've had a very large portfolio, and it's been very successful. And the Mars Foundation has no particular say. They're interested in that the work all relates to human-animal interactions, but they do not pick the grants. The grants are selected in the same way that all other NIH grants are selected. So those were the themes that I wanted to hit tonight. I wanted to summarize and, again, bestow my gratitude on the Hood Foundation, thanking them for the personal support that I received, but thanking them on behalf of myself and everybody in this room, the crucial role that you've played in helping young investigators succeed at the most vulnerable times in our careers. NICHD is making data accessible at no or low cost to help jumpstart young investigators. And it's very important. Remember that when you are looking at a young investigator's grant, although I understand this is not the case so much that it's so competitive now for Hood Foundation grants that you get people who are very productive. But back in the days, you were trying to decide between two equally promising young investigators, and one had 3 publications and one had none, and you tended to go with the one who had 3 publications. So it's very important to show productivity at an early age. I think everyone should feel good that NIH is maximizing opportunities for early stage investigators and early established investigators. We particularly at NICHD are extremely committed to young investigators, and we will continue to analyze our training portfolio, because it could be that the 1999 to 2001 cohort was different than people who graduated more recently. But we will do that so that we can get the maximum return on our investment. And we are also leveraging dollars through partnerships with like-minded organizations. And Dr. Collins has certainly promoted working with other organizations to maximize and leverage our federal dollars. And speaking of our federal dollars, as a federal employee, of course, I cannot lobby and I cannot tell you what to do, but I would say that part of my job, and a very important part of my job, is meeting with members of Congress. And when I meet with academics, I get a lot of hand-wringing and anxiety, but I do want to leave you with the message that Congress is extremely supportive of NIH, and this is bipartisan support. Our own Congressman Tip O'Neill, who is the Speaker of the House, if you go outside the TD Bank North Garden here in Boston, there's a little plaque to Tip O'Neill, who famously said, "All politics is local." I'm going to add the Bianchi coda to that, because in my meeting with various members of Congress over the past year, literally within the first minute or so when you meet a representative, they will immediately tell you their life history or some health problem that they've had, their child had, their neighbor had, whatever. You know, Representative Rosa DeLauro, anybody here from Yale tonight? So your Congresswoman, nobody, did somebody raise their hand in the back? Yes. Your Congresswoman is Rosa DeLauro, who is on the House Appropriations Committee. Literally, I shook her hand and she said, "You know, I'm an ovarian cancer survivor." It's not a HIPAA violation. She's very public about this. But that's a very typical experience that I've noticed in the past year. So I would say that if all politics is local, all appropriations is personal. And it's all about personal advocacy. And so whatever you can do, I was pleased to see that some of you have been so successful that you've actually left Boston and you are in other parts of the country. And it's extremely important to speak to your representatives wherever you live. And equally importantly, which people frequently forget, is send them a thank you note. When they up the NIH budget, we all benefit. And Representative Cole, who heads the House Appropriations Committee, on more than one occasion, I have personally heard him say he is committed to plussing up the NIH budget. So I do feel very good about the future, but we have to continue to thank our representatives. And it is a bipartisan effort. And remember that because appropriations are personal, if you know that there's a representative who is working in an area that you have, if you are working in an area in which you know there is a representative who's been affected by that, you can be an extremely effective advocate. So that is my concluding message. I want to congratulate the Hood Foundation on their 75th birthday and to thank them for supporting the next generation of scientific leaders and the pediatric medical research that transforms the health of children and families all over the world. So thank you very much.